So take for instance, maybe you're coming with your spouse or you're coming with your entire family. You should be asking yourself things like, do I have a plan of action if maybe when we get here my spouse is not able to find a job within the first 3 to 6 months? How am I going to support my family? How am I going to ensure that my kids are fed? How are we going to pay the rent? These are the sort of questions that you need to be asking yourself well before you even book that ticket to come over here to the UK. Because the reality is, whilst a lot of people get excited about the prospect of a life here in the UK, a lot of people are actually quite unaware of what the realities of living as an immigrant is like here in the UK. In today's video, I'm going to be shedding some light on some of the harsh reality of what life is like living here in the UK for a lot of you who might be considering to relocate to the UK. I think it's very important that before you make a big decision such as relocating your family and your entire life from another country, you need to understand what the real reality of what it's like living here in the UK. And this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video. For those of you who are just seeing my face for the very first time, my name is Tess, and on this channel, I share a lot of relocation tips and resources for those who are looking to come over to the UK. So if you're an individual, if you're a working professional, or indeed if you're a family looking to come over here and settle to the UK, this is the channel you need to be subscribed to. So don't waste any further time and tap that subscribe button and tap the little notification bell to receive all notifications from this channel whenever a new video is published. The first thing you need to understand about living in the UK is that the UK is a heavily regulated country. Now, depending on what country you're actually coming from, this can be a real shock to the system. So you want to make sure that when you do arrive in the UK, you are quickly familiarizing yourself with the laws and regulations of the country, things you should be doing and things you ought not to do, because otherwise you can quickly find that you're running into a lot of trouble with the authorities. The next thing you need to be aware of about the reality of coming over here to the UK as an immigrant is that you need to have a plan of action. Okay, this is where a lot of people typically fail, because you're coming in from one country and you're coming into the UK. The systems here are different. So take for instance, maybe you're coming with your spouse or you're coming with your entire family. You should be asking yourself things like, do I have a plan of action if maybe when we get here my spouse is not able to find a job within the first 3 to 6 months? How am I going to support my family? How am I going to ensure that my kids are fed? How are we going to pay the rent? These are the sort of questions that you need to be asking yourself well before you even book that ticket to come over here to the UK. Because the reality is that, like I said before, the systems here are different. Many of the time, when you come here and you think, oh, I'll get a job within the first month or within the first 2 months, and then we'll buy a house, 6 months after that, I can tell you now that a lot of that is going to be a whole lot more different to how you imagine it. Just because it is very, very competitive here. Things are very expensive. We'll come onto the expense and cost of living side later on in the video. But for what I'm going to say is that you need to have a detailed plan of action sequentially, as it relates to housing, as it relates to job, as it relates to, your cost of living. How are you going to manage those things? And be very, very detailed and specific about every angle of that plan. Okay, the last thing you want is to relocate yourself and your family. Maybe you have a very decent job in the current country that you're living in right now, and you come over to the UK and then you find that you've actually shortchanged yourself and you're not able to, at the worst case scenario, find a job, or at the very best case scenario, you get a job but it's not paying you nearly half of what you were earning in the country that you've relocated from. So bear in mind that also a lot of people that come into the UK, they're coming in with qualifications that typically are not recognized by the UK system. So many a times, a lot of people actually have to undergo retraining and getting requalified to actually be able to be recognized by a lot of UK employers. So this is something else you need to bear in mind. Let's talk about schooling. Okay, so The schooling system here in the UK is actually not bad. The only thing I would say is that if you're coming here with young children, particularly under the age of 4, then you need to know that state schooling doesn't actually kick in until a child turns 4. Okay, so before a child turns 4, you need to be ready to pay some seriously hefty nursery fees. Okay, the average nursery fees that a lot of parents pay per month for a child that's going to nursery full-time currently stands anywhere from about £1,200 per month right up to £1,400 per month. Okay, and you don't really get much of a discount, you know, if you have subsequent children that you're also sending into nursery at the same time under the age of 4. So you need to bear this in mind. I would definitely say that you need to factor in that for the first 4 years of any child you may be thinking of having in the UK, you have to make sure that you've really thought and factored in what the childcare costs are going to be and how you're going to manage that alongside the cost of living here in the UK. You know, mortgage is not cheap, house rents are not cheap, so you have to really be asking yourself those kind of detailed questions. Again, on the topic of schooling, this actually applies right up until the child is at least 12 or 16. How are you going to manage actually having your children in school or in nursery whilst having to juggle your 9 to 5? What a lot of people coming into the UK don't know is that the nursery schooling system and generally the state schooling system falls at a different time hours to what your usual working hours will be. So the average school time for a child here in the nursery will start anywhere from, I don't know, 8, usually 8:30 or 9, and they will finish around 3:30, 3 to 3:30, generally speaking. But you as the adult will typically need to be at work, I don't know, from 9, depending on what your schedule is, and you'll finish somewhere around 5. So the issue a lot of parents have in the UK usually falls on who is going to drop the child off in the morning before they go to work, or 2, who is going to pick up the child when the child finishes from nursery but they are not yet finished at work, because the child would have finished at 3:30 and you won't be finishing until 5, right? So this is where the talk of having a flexible working life balance really kicks in. What a lot of people generally tend to do, which helps a whole lot, is they most likely arrange for maybe a relative in the best case scenario, or in the worst case scenario, a close friend or a close neighbor that they trust to actually help them with picking and dropping off their children from school in the times that they can't actually make it. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to manage the work-life balance as it applies to your children's schooling and also your work and family life before you actually come over here to the UK. Now let's go on to talking about the emotional and psychological aspect of a life here in the UK. Now, before you get your permanent residency, it is really tough, okay? I'm going to be completely honest with you, it is extremely tough because a lot of people will generally go through processes, you know, through with immigration where they might get denied, you know, once, twice, maybe even several times, and you are constantly being faced with this uncertainty of not really knowing of whether you're actually going to be able to have a life here in the UK. And that can be very unsettling and very worrying for a lot of families and a lot of people who are in that situation here in the UK. Before you make those plans to come over here to the UK, you need to prepare yourself mentally and physically and really emotionally, I would say, for that aspect of living as an immigrant here in the UK, because the reality is it is very difficult, it's emotionally draining, and it takes a whole lot out of even the strongest willed individual, okay? Now, following on from the topic of schooling that I mentioned earlier on, let's talk about university, okay? Because you might very well have children who you're bringing along here to the UK and you want to put them through university, or you might be in a scenario yourself where you're actually looking to go back to school and go into university yourself. So what you might not be aware of is that here in the UK, if you're going into university and you don't currently have the right to live here and remain here, then you will actually be faced with having to pay the international fees for your university. Okay, so international student fees at UK universities typically is anywhere from 2.5 times or even 3 times more than the price home students will pay. So there's a big significance and a big gap, and you need to factor that in if and when you do decide you're bringing your children over here to the UK, or you are looking to actually come to study here in the UK yourself. Also, don't forget that coming in to actually study in the UK, you also have to factor in, the accommodation costs of the university and the city in which you're going to study in. Any kind of lifestyle costs that you will be accumulating whilst you're studying here in the UK. Obviously, a lot of the prices and a lot of the costs you will pay generally will depend on where it is you're studying. So for instance, if you're studying and living in a city like London, the costs are going to be significantly more and significantly higher than, say, if you're studying at a university up north further in, say, maybe Manchester, Leeds, or Liverpool, for instance. That brings me on to talking about the cost of living. Okay, I'm sure you would have heard all about the cost of living in the UK and the general cost of living rising across many countries around the world. But the UK is particularly expensive. I will be very honest with you, it's very expensive. So it means that if you are planning on relocating here to the UK, you have to bear in mind that, the price that you will pay for things like your mortgage, your utility bills, your insurance, these are gonna generally be different to whatever price you may be currently paying in the country where you are. The average rental amount that a family or renting a 2-bedroom house would expect to pay here in the UK on a monthly basis, and this doesn't include bills, will stand at anywhere from 1,300 to 1,500 at the very minimum end, I would say, depending again on which city you are living in, okay, and depending on what facilities the house has and what area it is within that city that you're actually in. So like I said before, this cost doesn't actually include any costs that you will then add on to pay for your bills, i.e. your electricity bills, your gas bills, your water bills on a monthly basis. And then you also have the cost of actually of groceries and shopping and, feeding your family. So these are all things and questions that I think it's very important for you to actually consider and ponder on before you actually make that decision of whether relocating to the UK is indeed the best decision for you or for you and your family.